welcome to a new episode of PR360. And I'm your host, Brett Dice. If you could please subscribe to PR360 on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Leave a review. It really does help with the rankings. And let me know how I am doing. And this week we have Joe McLeod with us. And he is pretty good at what we're going to be talking about, which is crisis comm, which everybody needs to know because sometimes just stuff hits the fan and you just have to deal with things that go on. But a little bit about him is that he's worked with clients on PR strategy, social media campaigns, reputation management, storytelling, concepts, and more. And he has over 15 years of experience in public relations and marketing experience as well. So welcome to the show, Joe.
Thanks, Brett. It's good to be with you.
And first question I ask all my guests is, are you a coffee or tea drinker?
I drink coffee in the morning and tea in the afternoon. And I used to be just straight up coffee, but I tried to limit my caffeine intake. And so I enjoy both. That's the benefit of drinking both, is you get to enjoy coffee and the benefits of tea.
It's true. I mean, if both are good, if you get really good coffee and really good tea, they're both really good. If you get okay coffee and okay tea, they're all right.
That's right. Well, I have a question for you because I know you're a coffee connoisseur, and this past week was National Coffee Day. And I put out on social media, I asked the question, is there something about coffee that PR people are drawn to it, like in this profession? Do you think there's something about this profession that makes us want coffee more?
It's just that hit of caffeine that wakes you up. I think that's the main thing, because most people I talk to, yes, they mostly say coffee, but it's always about the caffeine hit, because a lot of people, I'm not saying that people don't understand coffee, but they do actually not understand coffee from the millions of different ways you can actually roast it, and even roasting it different ways can produce different flavors is the best way of saying it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. I think there's something else too, because those of us in PR, not everyone, but it's a relational profession, and coffee is just something good. Like when you have a good cup of coffee, it's meant for community. And so I think it just lends itself to what we do as relational people. And so I don't know if that's true, but that's just a hypothesis to why those of us in PR gravitate towards coffee.
It could be another aspect of it. I do think that when you associate meeting with people, you a lot of times associate with getting coffee. So there is that aspect of it. And most part, people just go to Starbucks to meet people, which is fine if you like Starbucks and everything. But when you start to get into actual coffee, you go, oh, okay, this is how cold brew gives you the biggest hit, mind you. And then different ways of brewing coffee, like pour over will give you more of the taste that you want to experience the coffee with, as opposed to drip. But drip's the easiest one to actually produce the coffee. So it always depends on what you are looking for.
See, that's good. See, I didn't know all that. I'll have to remember next time I get coffee. I'll be a little more conscientious about how I order it.
Yeah, if you get pour over, if it's good coffee, you will taste the flavor notes.
Okay.
Drip, you will kind of taste it, but pour over, you really will taste it.
All right. So I'm going to ask for pour over next time I go in.
But anyways, we got off to a tangent about coffee, and I could probably talk about it for I don't know how long. But when you stick back to what we're talking about, which is crisis comm, which, I mean, I guess you could say you need a lot of coffee for that, because that could be a headache in itself. But I gave a brief overview of your expertise. Can you give a little bit more to our audience?
Yeah, so I started in public relations. It's been almost 18 years now, so I'm not quite at 20, but in some capacity, I've worked in PR for about 18 years. And I started off in the nonprofit sector, and then I migrated over to academia. I began teaching courses in communications, and I got my master's degree, and really enjoyed that. I enjoyed being in a learning environment and then sharing what I learned. And so I basically took what I was learning in the classroom and what I was teaching, and I wanted to move that into the boardroom and be able to work outside of a college campus and work with companies. And so back in 2012, my business partner, who happens to be my brother, Chad, who's on this podcast a while back, he and I decided that we would start our own firm. And he has a background in PR. He went a different route. But we started up our firm, and we started in training, doing public relations training, working with organizations on communication effectiveness, presentation skills, public speaking. And then we expanded into not just training, but doing consulting, doing media relations, campaigns. But what we have really gotten into over the past couple of years, and one of our specialties is crisis communications. And so that's been something that's been important to us. We love to be able to come alongside organizations and work with them as they are preparing for or going through a public relations crisis.
Gotcha. You might want to go with Activision Blizzard, see if they actually need any help with their crisis plan, because they're not doing well right now.
Yeah, there's no shortage of case studies and examples to pull from of people who are really missing it.
But actually, it's my next question is, what is an effective crisis plan?
Well, I'll start with what it's not. It's not a 3-ring binder with hundreds of pages and tabs and indexes and charts that sits on a shelf or is tucked away in a file cabinet. In fact, the crisis plans that we help companies create are just a few pages. But really, it is a guide for what the company is going to do in the event of a crisis. It's going to identify who your players are, the team, the flow of information, and also just really your philosophy of communication, your principles, like don't lie, be transparent. And so, an effective plan, it's not just something that is written and stashed away. It really needs to be a mentality throughout the organization, especially the leadership. And that's why we encourage leaders, executive teams, to go over your crisis plan at least once a year to walk through it. And that's something we will do with clients is you just sit down and we'll go through scenarios, and we'll start off by asking, what are the threats out there? What are your vulnerabilities as an organization? What could happen tomorrow that could impact the organization for the rest of the week, the rest of the year? What are your threats? And when you ask those questions, it's amazing what people will say. And so it needs to be something that is talked about, that you're walking through and talking through with the organization and with its leaders. But yeah, it needs to be a plan that you're conscious. It needs to be a plan to where you're conscientiously aware of, you're going through, you're walking through the steps together. It needs to be inclusive, to where you're bringing, it's not just the CEO, it's not just the CCO or the crisis manager. It's not one person, it's your team. You're bringing in people, and you're getting different perspectives, different ideas. You let people know that, hey, we need to be crisis aware. No organization is immune from a crisis. And so it needs to be inclusive. It needs to be simple. A plan is only as good as its ability to be executed. And so if it's too cumbersome or too layered, I mean, it might look great on paper, but if it can't be understood and then acted out, then it's too complicated and it won't work. It also needs to be tailored to the organization. We work with clients in different sectors, and so what might work for one nonprofit organization, one crisis plan may need to be different for an energy company or for some other type of business. So certainly needs to be tailored to the organization. And another thing is that a good crisis plan helps in times when it's not a crisis. Like when you're going through and assessing your communication apparatus, you're looking at your channels, your audience, how you're communicating internally and externally. A lot of times there are things that come about from that you discover, hey, we can do this differently. We can do this better. And we've seen where companies will make improvements to their communication as part of their crisis planning. So all of those elements that I mentioned are a part of what we would call a good crisis PR plan.
Gotcha. And then, I mean, since everybody knows about the pandemic, and
Right.
everybody's been saying just how much we've had to pivot, which is true. I'm not saying it's not true, but how has that changed the crisis comm or how to deal with crisis during the pandemic? Because I'm pretty sure there's been some things that you can't do now that you could do before.
Yeah, well, first of all, the pandemic made everyone aware that they are susceptible to a crisis. I mean, it affected everyone. And we used to think of a crisis, I say we, like the collective we, like not people in PR, but often people will think that a crisis is the local news reporter you come into your door or following you to your car because there's some scandal going on. Well, crisis can be really anything that disrupts business as usual, and it causes your organization to have to rethink how it's doing its operations. It's having to communicate and let people know the decisions that are being made. And so it's everybody was susceptible to this. Everybody was affected by it, and which means everybody's susceptible to a crisis. And so I think that was the biggest change, is just people were now no longer under the illusion that it's somebody else is going to be affected by it, that it affects us. And I didn't hear many leaders talking about communication not being important anymore, because it really is. But I think another way that the pandemic changed the way we do crisis communications is that it really expanded the definition. It broadened the definition of a crisis. A crisis isn't just, like I said, the media descending on your organization. It could be internal. The crisis may happen, and there'd be no news stories about it, but it's something within your organization has occurred, and business as usual has been disrupted, and you are called and required to act on that. And if you don't, or if you do it poorly, it's only going to make things worse. And so we're seeing organizations that are struggling now to communicate internally. Just one example is like, the big, I almost said recession, where people are leaving their jobs, the big resignation, and how do companies communicate internally? How do they recruit? So a crisis takes different forms, and I think now, since you've been a year and a half or more into the pandemic, that organizations are seeing that the definition is much broader than maybe they realized.
Gotcha. And then even when you were talking about like how crisis plans can help you when it's not a crisis, how do PR pros tell the difference between an issue and a crisis? Because not everything's a crisis and not everything's an issue. And sometimes we need to balance that out going, should we basically have all hands on deck, or should we just wait this out?
Yeah, that's a great point. And basically, the difference is severity. I mean, an issue is just a bump in the road. It's an inconvenience. Maybe it's something that was posted on social media that was taken the wrong way and invited some criticism, and you had to respond, but it really didn't upend your business. It didn't it didn't consume a lot of resources. It's probably going to die away or die pretty quickly. A crisis is obviously longer, and it eats up more resources, whether it's financial, personnel. So it's the level of severity, and sometimes there may be disagreements on, is this an issue or it's a crisis, depending on who you ask. But you're right. If you overreact to an issue, you might well invite a crisis. But if you underreact to a crisis, then you make the crisis worse.
So is there a way to judge the severity? Because sometimes we're like, oh, it's not that bad. Only one news person has picked it up, but then all of a sudden it might explode on social media. You're like, wait, I wasn't expecting that. So is there a way to pivot on the issue to a plan? To a crisis, because it could be that an issue is just an issue, and then all of a sudden it blows up without you doing anything into a crisis. Is there a way of managing that? Because I feel like sometimes it's like PR pros like, oh, this is just an issue, and it's like, well, a day or two later, oh, well, it looks like it's going to become a crisis soon.
And it could be, because it's dynamic, and you never really know for sure. I think that's why having good listening mechanisms out there, social listening, being able to see what's trending, is your organization being mentioned on social media, Are there other issues or crises that are occurring that your organization could be connected with? So it's a judgment call. But I think it just kind of depends on, does it look like things are getting better or are they getting worse? And so if they're getting worse, you're getting into crisis mode. If it looks like things are, you've responded what you think is an effective response and it seems to be working, then that could be an indication that it's an issue and it's short-lived and you can move on, and it's not going to be a big deal.
Gotcha. And then when there is a crisis, how can PR pros reason with those people that are upset? I know you're not going to convince everybody because there's just no way everybody's going to be like, all right, 100% of us agree on this. But how do you get the majority of people?
Yeah, it's tough. Well, a lot of times we hear that you can't reason with emotion. And at face value, I understand that, but you can reason, and it's important to approach it the right way. You're not going to be able to reason with emotional people until you validate the emotion. It's a big PR principle that is often missed. A lot of times we like to just go to the message, and we like to go right to reason, right to the facts, right to the data. And it's not that the information is wrong, but the audience has not been primed to receive that information. So if you bypass the emotion and get right to the information, it typically won't work. You have to validate why people are upset, why they're afraid, why they're angry. And from that doesn't mean you necessarily agree with it, but it means that you're validating, you're showing empathy. And then from there, you're in a better position to be able to make your case.
Gotcha. And then that's also is one of my questions, like, should PR pros appeal to the emotion or to the sense? Or the reason, I should say, because that is kind of the thing, because you could appeal to the emotion. It's a lot easier to do that, a lot easier to convince people through emotion. But is there a way to maybe do both, or maybe do more of reason? Because reason will last longer than emotion. Emotion, you'll just be like, why was I met again? I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. That's a great question, Brett. Really both. I mean, reason, you can't bypass emotion. And I think that's the biggest lesson that we have to remember when it comes to messaging and communicating when people are in a heightened state of emotion. You can't bypass that. You have to validate it, whether we agree or not. One thing that we came up with not long ago, we call it our ASAP model. And ASAP is an acronym. It stands for acknowledge. What's this? Acknowledge people's emotion and not acknowledge where they are. Doesn't mean you agree with it, but you're validating why they feel what they feel. S is the situation. Explain what is going on. Give us some context for what is happening. A is action. What action are you taking, and what action might others need to take in order to get through the problem? And P is picture. Picture like what it would look like if we all did our part and worked together, and what would it look like?
So we were talking about just
ways to avoid. The ASAP model, I think, works really well because
everybody thinks when they do crisis planning, oh, we got all our bases covered, we got everything done,
and
nothing's going to happen to us.
You have to do in order to get credibility.
There's probably some ways we're like, oh, should have thought of
to be able to.
So, what are some key
get
things
them
to avoid
the place to where they will listen to reason?
Crisis plan for PR professionals or pros.
A lot of times, PR planning, and especially when it comes to crisis planning, is something that everybody knows is important, but we don't put it in the urgent category. It's like important, not urgent quadrant. And so I would say when it comes to, I don't know so much what people leave out of the plan. I mean, obviously you want to make sure that that people who might be interacting with the public, like the frontline folks, whether it's people who are answering the phone, people who are out on the field, they understand, like, if there's a media inquiry, where do they channel that media request, or who do they send it to? And it's very basic, but you don't want to have an employee that just takes it upon themselves to be the media spokesperson when you don't know what they're going to say. They might not have all the information. And so, I mean, that's a critical point. It's just to ensure that even when times are calm, that people know when to, and they know when a reporter or any member of the media reaches out, that they need to send that to this person. There's a clear identified individual. There's a process, and it's simple. And I think it's good for companies to send that out on a regular basis. I mean, not every month, but just so people know. If not, then your employees might get a little suspect if all of a sudden they're getting all these directives, hey, if the media contacts you, do this or do this. And they're like, well, why would the media be contacting us? What's going on here? So you don't want to feed the rumor mill unnecessarily. So I would just say that's one thing. It's just to make sure that people who need to be in the loop are included in that plan.
Gotcha. And then, are there any groups of people that will never be convinced or reached? Do you think that there's just going to be that little sector of people that is just, when you do everything right, because sometimes we do everything right and there's still problems with it. Are there's just going to be some people who just be like, well, we'll do our best, but there's just some group of people that's just never going to reach, no matter how good your apology is, no matter how good your plan to change is going to happen. It's just one of those things that's just a wash.
Right. And the quicker that we recognize that, the better, because there are those that will not believe your message. They're going to be totally against what you say, and you can't win them over. So you have to put that group aside. But the caveat is don't lump everybody in that group, because if you do, then you become cynical and you think, well, nobody's going to believe us. Everybody's, the public is unreasonable, and remember, the public is just a collection of individuals. And so you don't want to put everybody in that group, but it is important to know that that group exists. You're really trying to appeal to people who are open enough to be able to receive your message, that are at least going to give it some consideration. An example of this, and it's a glaring example, is with vaccines. Like there's a difference between being vaccine hesitant and being an anti-vaxxer. Like there's two different, the anti-vaxxers, it doesn't matter what you say when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccination, they're not getting it. But somebody who's vaccine hesitant, they're like, well, I just don't know enough about it. Okay, well, that's someone that is at least open to hearing more about whether or not it's safe. And when you have the government or organizations that are trying to encourage people to get their COVID-19 vaccination, that you don't want to discount the fact that there are people who are receptive to it, and because of that, you want to make sure that you're not insulting them either. That they are, if there is a valid concern that they have, you have to acknowledge it. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with empathy and acknowledging. You say, yeah, I can understand how it might be nerve-wracking and it's new territory, and but this is what we believe to be the best thing. We think it's safe. We think it's good for everybody. Here's our argument. Here's why. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that in our society, people get a say-so. And so as PR practitioners, we can't make anybody do anything. We have to make the best case. We have to be able to defend our position. But people get a choice. And so yeah, I think that if we realize that there are those who are just going to reject the message, that's fine. It's okay. That's their prerogative, but there are those who will be open to it, and that's the ones that we really need to focus in on as we are crafting our message.
Gotcha. And then, what does the future of crisis comm look like? Does it look like more of a fasted approach with videos, podcasts, live streaming, if you can do it, and trying to get to that more authentic touch, because I feel like more authentic touch means you got to be a little bit more, I guess, live or a little bit more raw or something in that similar vein. So is that where PR pros have to branch out more when it comes to other mediums and forms?
Yeah, I think we need to be versatile and to be able to use these different platforms according to the message that we're trying to deliver, where the audience is, but not to make sure that what we're doing is, like, when we take in all these tools, all these options, that we're using judgment as to which is the best platform, which is the best medium in this case. You mentioned authenticity. That's an important part. I mean, people want to know that that there's a human behind their organization, and especially in a crisis. And so, video and different tools can be effective. We've seen examples to where you have the CEO maybe releasing a video, a YouTube video addressing the issue. That can be very effective. You also have to look at issues like timing. When is it appropriate to say what? Today, the media landscape has changed so much that oftentimes reporters, they may be calling to speak to a spokesperson or to speak to a representative, or they're going on that company's website, on their social channels, and they're looking for what is the company saying. And so you can use your platforms as really a multi-audience reach. You're obviously reaching the audience that follows you, but you're making your information, your statements, your content available to reporters and others that are going to disseminate it on a broader level. So it's really, I think judgment is something that we have to employ as we are considering which of these tools to use.
All right. And fun question for you. If you could automate crisis comm, where would you want to automate it?
That is a fun question. You know how, like, if you use Google Translate, you type in a sentence and then it'll give you how to say it in all these different languages, Spanish, French, Urdu, Portuguese, whatever. It's like you take your pick. If I could automate something, I would say you type out a message and the program would say it, not changing the meaning, but tailor the message to the various audiences. It would just do it automatically. That's what in PR we're paid to do. We're paid to make sure that we're getting the message. We're not changing it. We're not saying one thing to someone over here and a contradicting message to this person over here. It's the same message, but there may be components of the message that are different because they apply to the uniqueness of the audience. So that's a good question, but that would be my preference.
All right. Yeah, that'd be nice to actually have it where you type in a message and it just translates or says it differently to different audiences, but the meaning's still the same.
Right. And that's the key. It would have to be the same.
All right. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, first of all, Brett, thanks for having me. I love your podcast, and so it's good to be a guest and be here. So I appreciate the conversation. I think what I would say, just to conclude, is this is when we look around our world. There's a lot. There's a lot that's going on that could make us discouraged. But I really think this is a time for those in PR, to really step up and to use our profession in a way that's for the good. And I know that sounds idealistic, but I mean, what's the alternative to say, well, we don't even try? But I think leaders they realize today that there's a need for communication. And so I think we can, as PR pros, really take this opportunity to, pardon the cliche, but to really get our seat at the table and to really step up and say, look, we can't solve every problem in this world, but we can help address communication, and we can help people and companies communicate more effectively. And that's a big problem. And that will set us up for solving problems down the road if we can just improve the way we're communicating. So that would just be something I would just encourage all your listeners, whether they're in PR or not, that there really is an opportunity, and I would just encourage us all not to be discouraged.
So what you're saying is that we need to improve relations in public relations.
Absolutely. I mean, it's 50% of the phrase, right? The relation part, right? Absolutely.
All right, we need to get on this. We're so good at doing it for businesses, we forget to do it for PR in general.
That's right.
All right, that's a good final thoughts. And thank you, Joe, for joining PR 360. We're always glad to have you or anybody else on that is kind of a thought leader in their little perspective industry. But thank you for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brett.
And thank you for joining